And Dana, you are, I don't know, I think the current generation of contextual behavioral science, relational frame theory, and you're so prolific. And so you do such great work, and I'm privileged to know you and to work with you. And now we get to share you with this group and beyond through this recording. And so I think with that, I'll have you carry it, take it away.
Amazing. And thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege to work with you and everyone else in prosocial world as well. And we really appreciate the invitation to present. We've gotten to work together on a few big projects like the science of the new sphere, and others that have come up, dual inheritance theory, that kind of work. Today, we're really diving into the applied work that we've been doing, taking this prosocial approach and integrating it into special education programs, integrating it into mental health services, specifically ABA services. And we changed the title of the talk like 10 minutes ago to Prosocial as the behavior analyst views it, which is kind of a play on the paper that really kickstarted the field or behaviorism as a philosophy, and eventually the field of applied behavior analysis, which is the field that we come from, which was a paper written by John Watson called As the Behaviorist Views It. So this is our presentation, Prosocial as the behavior analyst views it. So let's dive in, and Dana, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll jump in too.
Yeah, I just want to echo Jordan's gratitude for the opportunity to present to you all today. We are very much looking forward to it. Hope that you find some interesting or useful information from today. We just wanted to briefly introduce ourselves. I will probably briefly do it. Can never count on Jordan to be too brief with anything. But I started my career as a special education teacher. I went to Loyola University in Chicago and then found my way to Southern Illinois University for my master's and doctorate in behavior analysis and therapy, where I studied with Dr. Mark Dixon. And my work there focused on relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment theory. So from there, went to work at Missouri State University, where I became associate professor, and then just recently relocated and started a position at Ball State University in their Department of Special Education.
Awesome, thank you. And for me, I did my undergraduate degree in behavioral psychology at St. Lawrence College, which was really unique in that it was the opposite of an eclectic education. It was very much a specific education in applied behavior analysis, its history, its applications. And I, took that and went to Southern Illinois University, where I met Dana. We were in the same research lab together. Eventually, built out a behavior analysis program together at Missouri State University. Built out a clinical psychology doctorate program at Missouri State University. Got married around the same time that we started all of that. So I don't know, that's kind of our joint history together. And then for me, I just decided to ditch the university system entirely, and accepted a position as the clinical director at a new startup company called Antiva Behavioral Health. And I'm excited to share some of the ideas of how we're thinking to integrate prosocial into this new venture. And then Dynamic Behavior Science is actually Dana and my joint company. It's a consultation and research company. We have a de-affiliated research lab that has about 20 students from multiple universities who are part of it, kind of continuing on this research, writing up a lot of the data that we've collected over the past 5 years, and so on, and really helping to support and resource organizations, largely using this prosocial approach to behavioral systems. And so all of this, I'm defining prosocial to this group. Mostly, this is defining prosocial, I guess, how we view it or how we perceive it, and knowing that each person likely perceives it in slightly different ways and is using it in a multitude of different ways, which that variation is, I think, part of the power of this prosocial approach. Anthony Biglin defined prosocial behavior as a constellation of values, attitudes, and behaviors that benefit individuals as well as those around them. And this can include behaviors and experiences like cooperation, well-being, self-development, kindness, productivity, creativity, and freedom. And so for us, the underlying question is, how can we create pro-social teams and organizations that accomplish what they're meant to accomplish, while its members feel and achieve their personal and professional values. And oftentimes we see that when we leave things to a control condition, these are viewed as like in opposition, right? Either people are achieving their personal and professional values, or the organization is accomplishing what it is intending to. For us, it's an and equation. We need both pieces happening all of the time if we're really saying that we're being pro-social. Now, we can also define pro-social as an intervention approach. And so in this case, it's an approach to fostering flexible and adaptive organizations and systems. There are three main underlying concepts or theories that really drive this pro-social approach, including acceptance and commitment therapy, or acceptance and commitment training, Ostrom's core design principles, or CDPs, as well as multi-level selection theory. So if we start at the top, what is this acceptance and commitment therapy thing? Well, it's attempting to increase something called psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility was defined by Hayes as contacting the present moment fully as a conscious human being, and based on what the situation affords, changing or persisting in behavior in the service of chosen values. It's easy to see how this cleanly links into an evolutionary account as we change and persist based on external environmental pressures. Now, for us, that definition from acceptance and commitment therapy is largely based on one-on-one clinical therapy or intervention for an individual. So how do we take this and apply it to systems? Well, we can say that ACT in Prosocial attempts to increase adaptive behavior by promoting flexibility in behavioral systems. In this case, we might start to talk about something like systems flexibility, as in contacting the present moment as a cohesive and informed group. And based on the purpose of the group, changing or maintaining systems in the service of collective values. And we just made that up right now. So who knows if it's right, but it kind of gives us a guiding point to what we're trying to do with Prosocial. The core design principles, obviously developed by Lynn Ostrom, first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And the problem that she was able to crack is the tragedy of the commons, finding that common resources, fisheries, oil, lands, etc., can be managed successfully by the people who use them rather than by government or private companies. And so oftentimes when we look at organizations, we see these top-down hierarchical structures where the people at the top make decisions for everyone else. And oftentimes that leads to negative outcomes. Instead, we want to have polycentric governance systems. Those who are the most impacted by decisions are in the room when those decisions are being made. And if we look at like 8 things or 8 principles that tend to guide pro-social groups, they include having shared identity and purpose, equitable costs and benefits, fair and inclusive decision-making systems, monitoring of agreed upon behavior, graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior, fair and efficient conflict resolution, self-governance, and opportunities for external collaboration. From like a behavior analytic perspective, these CDPs actually give us behavior change targets. So we could talk about groups that are low in pro-social engagement. And if we were to like graph that in a way, it might look something like this figure right here, where we don't see a lot of those CDPs happening within the behavioral system. Or we can talk about high pro-social systems where it's never perfect, it's never going to be, but we see a lot of engagement in these CDPs. And then finally, multi-level selection theory. Obviously at a biological or genetic level, we're talking about selection between genes within an individual, selection between individuals within groups, selection between groups within a population. The point is that evolution, like a geometric fractal, tends to follow the same laws as you move outward. For us, on the applied side, what does this look like in practice? And Robert Stiles created this figure that I love and I put in every presentation because it shows that what we need to do is look at psychological flexibility within the individuals in a group, promoting resilience when they show up to well-organized behavioral systems, to create a roadmap to engaging in these pro-social processes of systems that are flexible and contain those core design principles, to produce empowered teams that are able to adapt and respond to challenges that show up in the environment that they're in, constantly adapting, constantly evolving, constantly improving. And so that's kind of the goal of Prosocial in the context that we're in.
And we wanted to take a moment to introduce the field of applied behavior analysis. We weren't sure who would be attending today, so we didn't know kind of how familiar anyone would be, so I'm going to give a broad overview here. But ABA, or applied behavior analysis, is a scientific approach, the purpose of which is to improve socially significant behavior through the application of basic principles of behavior. So this is done through systematic analysis of behavior-environment interactions and the use of empirical methods that seek to identify functional relationships between and among variables within the behavior and the environment. So the field of ABA is not a monolith. The approaches are all grounded in the philosophy of behaviorism. However, there are different branches of behaviorism and different perspectives, theories, and approaches within the field of behavior analysis. So rather than try to talk about all of those, we thought we'd just briefly mention kind of our primary philosophical foundations that inform the work we do and how we approach these questions. So our background and training is grounded in Skinner's approach to radical behaviorism, which includes, to put it very as simply as I can, a focus on observable behavior, including private events, which are thoughts and feelings, verbal behavior that are viewed as behaviors influenced by the environment, like any overt or observable behavior might be. We also wanted to mention that early in Skinner's work, he published a novel called Walden 2, which he was as early as like 1948 starting to talk about like how can we apply these principles of behavior using experimentation to shape communities and to design communities to be as supportive of its members as possible. So I think even that early work was kind of hinting toward the important work that Prosocial is looking to contribute to now. And then more recently, we've seen kind of an expansion or a development from radical behaviorism, led largely by the work of Steve Hayes, called functional contextualism, which seeks to predict and influence events with precision, scope, and depth using empirically based concepts and rules. So the functional contextualist approach views very much the behavior as an act in its context. So the purpose here is to not separate the behavior from the environment in which it's occurring and the history of learning that produces how an individual might respond in any given context. Both of these approaches and our own have an underlying guiding philosophy of pragmatism, focusing on prediction and influence rather than abstract truth, and holding as kind of a compass the pragmatic truth criterion, which, to put simply, is that things are true in our approach so long as they work to address the issue or the question that we're seeking to answer. So now we kind of want to pivot to talking about designing prosocial interventions as behavior analysts, right? Our approach in the work we do when we are working with organizations, groups, agencies, schools, to address challenges that they are having with their students and their staff. So we thought we would kind of give like a sampling of some of the work that we're doing that highlights how our approach works out in the real world. And so to do this, we are going to, we've structured our presentation around what are called the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis, which were presented back in 1968 by Bear, Wolf, and Risley, where they produced an article at a time where there was becoming a distinction between the experimental analysis of behavior and the applied analysis of behavior. And so they sought out to articulate the defining elements of what makes applied behavior analysis applied behavior analysis. And these 7 items on the screen here are those 7 dimensions or the 7 components that should underlie the work of any behavior analyst. So the rest of our presentation, we're going to talk through these as they relate to our own work using the prosocial approach.
So the first dimension is applied, which means that we want to focus on socially significant behavior that directly improves people's lives and in the context where behavior is meaningfully occurring. And so we've had the opportunity to do this with multiple different sites. So Dana will explain 2 of the sites, and then I'll address a couple others.
So we've had great fortune to build relationships with a number of different sites where we've been working with them now at this point for most of them for years. So we've had the opportunity to really start to think about and build these approaches in working with them. So we wanted to highlight these not only so you have context for the work, but also to acknowledge their contributions, because we're working with them to design this stuff, but they are implementing it in their sites in real time. So the first is Apex Regional Program. This is a school in the Midwest that is designed as an alternative setting for students with severe behavior challenges. So these are students who are not able to be successful in the general education setting and are transitioned to Apex to have a high level of individualized support, both academically and with respect to their behavior. At Apex, this is a stressful place to work. There are a lot of aggressive and challenging behaviors that staff are dealing with all day, every day. And like the rest of the field of special education, they experience high rates of staff burnout. They can struggle with maintaining job satisfaction. And then in the field of disability services broadly, there are high rates of attrition. Apex is actually pretty good when it comes to keeping their staff, but that's largely because a lot of what they do now with Prosocial. So Apex is really susceptible to this because of working with these severe behavior cases. And we began working with them several years ago to focus on working with staff to implement acceptance and commitment therapy-based strategies in the classroom. So we've done a number of different things with this group, but what we wanted to focus on today are their needs and the desires they express to us to establish a more ACT-consistent climate within their school. So they were looking to more broadly infuse and occasion and integrate these ACT approaches, not just within specific behavior plans for students, but in their interactions with one another and with the students throughout the school day. So we worked with them to use the prosocial process to address some applied challenges that we were able to articulate, including how do we address certain critical uncertainties that influence staff morale and engagement. So we worked with them using more of the work developed by Robert Stiles to identify some key areas that were called critical uncertainties that we could address with them, informed by their perspectives to support them. And then also, how do we increase the use of ACT concepts in daily intervention strategies with students? Another group that we work with is called PLE. They're a little farther east, and they are a special education school as well. They serve students who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, and they are a partial hospitalization program. So we started working with them, beginning an in-service training on implementing programming a curriculum based in relational frame theory with special education students, the PEAK relational training system. So this is a curriculum we worked with Dr. Dixon to develop while we were at Southern Illinois University, and is used to teach language and cognitive skills to children, but largely children who are autistic. And so what we found when working with PLE is that staff were able to implement this technology. They had the skill set to sufficiently perform the tasks needed to get some good outcomes with their students. However, the question became in working with their administration is that are the staff having their own positive interactions with the technology, right? Were they happy, relaxed, engaged with the program themselves? And so we wanted to ask 2 questions here to address in our applied work. One was, can we influence positive experience and engagement around the peak technology? Can we help foster a positive relationship between the staff and this curriculum we were asking them to implement? And then second, can we help improve behavioral systems at the level of classrooms as individual units?
And that brings us to Emergent Learning Center. And this is really it's an ABA service provider that's providing treatment services for autistic learners and their families, insurance funded in the United States. And what we see in these settings, across settings, is like Dana was mentioning, high rates of staff burnout, high rates of stress, low levels of reported work and life satisfaction, and ultimately high rates of attrition. And the problem when we see those high rates of attrition is that that can impact the quality of services or the quality of care received by families. That impacts outcomes for autistic learners. That produces challenges like at a societal level when we're not able to support and resource neurominoritized folks in our society. And so really, like in this context, can we bring this prosocial approach to answer a really common applied challenge, which is, can we improve workplace climate and experiences of each of the core design principles? So can we actually address those directly using prosocial in an ABA service context? And then for us at Antiva Behavioral Health, which is another ABA service company, it's a unique opportunity because we're a startup ABA agency in Grand Rapids, Michigan, providing services to autistic children and their families. And really, this is an opportunity to build a prosocial program from the ground up, from the very beginning, like integrated within the very fabric of what this program is intended to do and what it's intended to become. This creates a lot of applied challenges. We don't have answers to these. So really, this is a question of generality more than anything. But some questions that are already popping up are, how do we embed prosocial into policies, procedures, hiring, and training practices within the organization? How do we resource the psychological flexibility and well-being of behavior technicians and behavior analysts after they've been employed? How can we engineer a positive and affirming workplace environment for everyone? And can we build prosocial networks within families and across peer groups? So this is actually a really interesting one. Social network analysis is a topic that's come up in a lot of conversations in prosocial. So our question is, well, can we look at a prosocial network analysis? And can we work with children and their families to build prosocial family and peer networks? And you can see why that would be really important when serving neurodivergent populations. So the next dimension then is behavioral. So we've identified some applied challenges that can be resolved using a prosocial framework, but what are the actual behaviors of interest? And so when we look at the behavioral dimension in ABA, we want to find behavior to predict and influence. This can include private and public behavior, meaning behavior that we can directly observe and measure, as well as behavioral experiences that can only be observed by the person doing it, things like thoughts, feelings, emotions. The point here is we want to de-emphasize constructs as causal variables, things happening in some other place or some other dimension, and really focus on behavior as the movement of the organism through space and time. And so if we look at Apex Regional Program, that first location that Dana described, the applied challenge is, how do we increase use of ACT concepts within daily intervention strategies with students? Well, if we look at actual behavior we can measure, one is our staff providing ACT consistent feedback to students on their daily progress notes. In this case, at the end of each class, the teachers and the paraprofessionals are giving direct feedback to the students in written form on their point sheets at the end of the class. And are their comments ACT consistent? Another question is, so on these same progress notes, the students actually give feedback to themselves based on their behavior during that class. And so a second question is, are students providing ACT consistent self-monitoring feedback to themselves on the daily progress notes? So when given the opportunity to write down, how did I do that day? Am I writing things down that are ACT consistent, suggesting that the concept is landing? In this case, the type of data that we can collect is permanent product. This is some of the easiest data to get because the daily progress notes already exist. We just need to operationally define what is ACT consistent or ACT inconsistent. And now we can look at how this ACT consistent feedback is evolving over time and in response to our prosocial intervention. And the second question is, how do we address critical uncertainties within the organization that influence staff morale and engagement? In this case, what we can look at is reported satisfaction with current policies and procedures at the organization. And in this case, using a lot of the strategies from Robert Stiles in his book, The Conversation, we worked with a voluntary task force from the school over the summer, and they identified these things as critical uncertainties that, if left unaddressed, would lead to a non-preferred and non-desirable future at the organization. But if we could really nail these things right, would lead to that preferred and probable future that the organization was aspiring towards. In this case, really common stuff that you see within special education and in ABA services. Policies related to scheduling, staff follow through of interventions, self-care, attendance policies, requests for time off, supporting committed actions, staff willingness to change what they're doing, the amount of training that people have to do in addition to the job, the expertise of the trainers, as well as the fluency of the implementers in actually delivering their instructional strategies. And for anyone who's worked in the ABA field, this is every day. So how are we addressing that? And the types of data that we might look at for satisfaction are self-report data. How does self-reported satisfaction change in response to our intervention? And we can also directly observe some of these things, such as staff follow-through. For plea, the question, can we influence positive experience and engagement around a difficult technology? In this case, we can actually measure relational responding patterns around peak as a technology, around plea itself as an agency, and we can even look at relational responding in terms of myself as an employee or as a member of this system. And to get that data, we use something called a multi-dimensional scaling procedure. And I'll show you guys that when we get to some of the analysis. And we can also look at like variation in different types of peak programming. And so what are the different ways that staff are actually using this technology? And we can get this through self-report, for example, tell me the different ways you use this technology, and we can do a variation analysis. Or we could simply do direct observation, which we did. So we can go to the school, observe what they're doing, take notes, take data, and see if we have a lot of variation in the way that they're delivering this technology, which is a good thing, because then those most effective variation can be selected and then can be retained within the organization, furthering that evolutionary account. And then finally, can we improve workplace climate and experiences of the core design principles? In this case, we might want to measure the affective or emotional experiences that people have when presented with common workplace stimuli. So when you see stuff from your workplace, are you like mad, upset, or are you feeling like excited and happy to be around those things? Type of data, we created something called an affect and willingness scale. That's a self-report measure that gives us that information. We might also want to look at the perceived consistency of workplace behaviors and the core design principles. And we can accomplish this using something that we developed called a PIC analysis, which is a self-report measure that looks at the performance of each CDP, the availability of information for each CDP, as well as community engagement within each CDP to create that PIC analysis. And then the next dimension is analytic. And so we want to use data, often at the level of the single subject, to inform decision-making. So we're making decisions based on data, not discourse, and to evaluate the effectiveness or efficacy of our interventions. And I want to point out here that what Prosocial challenges us to do at times is not just look at the single subject as an individual, as is typically done in ABA settings, but a subject can also be a group. A subject can be a behavioral system. A subject can be an organization. And this is that multi-level selection theory showing up in real time. Because what is the subject ebbs and flows and changes, and we can kind of dissect that in multiple different ways. So in our case, some of the questions that we were asking were, does performance feedback lead to an increase in ACT consistent feedback to students at Apex? And so in this case, if we're monitoring, so CDP, the first CDP, monitoring of agreed upon behavior, if we're tracking ACT consistent feedback, and then if we're actually having like members of the agency provide that information back to the staff. So saying, hey, we took data on your daily progress notes and what percentage of your notes were ACT consistent, and here's the data. Do we see a positive response in producing of more ACT consistent feedback? And actually, they did this with the students as well. And so they would provide visual performance feedback back to the students so that they knew the percentage of their own comments back to themselves that were ACT consistent. And so in this way, you also see the authority to self-govern because it's members of the organization that are delivering the intervention. And so here's what a time series graph starts to look like. In this case, you have the school days over the course of 61 school days. And you have like a baseline, which is we taught them what ACT consistent feedback would look like. And you see very low levels for both the staff and the students in engaging in that ACT consistent feedback. Visual performance feedback then is introduced. So now we're monitoring the agreed upon behavior. We're self-governing that information and giving it back to the group. And we see an increase in ACT consistent feedback from both the staff as well as the students. The group actually identified that a major barrier to this was that they were having a hard time thinking of ACT consistent things to say in the moment based on that feedback. And so they came up with the idea of having a list of ACT consistent statements and reviewing exemplars at each of these meetings. And so you see a bit of greater stability in the use of ACT consistent feedback. That information and those information cards were faded out. And you see the continuation of the use of ACT consistent feedback. This is for the middle school. And then you see the exact same results showing up at the high school. And so we're able to replicate that same intervention effect. What was really interesting is the kids at the middle school actually started competing with the kids from the high school. So they wanted to know what the high school data were so that they could try to beat it, which was just kind of a fascinating kind of interlocking system that emerged naturally within that group. A next question was with respect to satisfaction with different policies and procedures at Apex. Does a group problem-solving strategy that really is built around the prosocial matrix lead to greater satisfaction with those policies and procedures? In this case, we're really focusing on fair and inclusive decision-making. So making sure that everyone is involved in that decision-making so that it's fair and it includes everyone. And in that, the authority to self-govern. And so the policies and procedures that affect you were in part informed by you and can be modified by you and the group through the prosocial process. And all this really shows here is we have the different critical uncertainties that were identified by the task force, scheduling, follow through, self-care, attendance, etc. What we would do is we would first start with scheduling, use the prosocial matrix to talk through what are the barriers or challenges around scheduling. The group would come up with an intervention. So how are we going to improve our policy moving forward? So where you see a white bar, it means that that uncertainty was not addressed yet. Where you see a black bar, that just means that it had been addressed using the prosocial matrix. And so you see an immediate improvement in their perception of, or positive perception of scheduling in response to intervention. In terms of follow through, you see that going up over time. In terms of self-care, you see that they're feeling more connected with their self-care in response to intervention. Same thing generally with attendance, although attendance was great week 1, as it typically is, and then it goes down quickly after that. What's really interesting though in these data are that there are actually multiple critical uncertainties that we never got to. So we never got to talk about training volume. We never got to talk about training expertise or fluency, but you see those policies going up in terms of the staff positive ratings over time. And so what's fascinating here is that by addressing some critical uncertainties using a prosocial process, we see the generalization of that to other critical uncertainties within the organization without even having to overtly discuss them in a structured way. Likely they were discussing them outside of the context. Another question then is, can we create an individualized workshop that's based on process-based network analysis and direct observation to improve staff perception of the peak relational training system? So this is, how is this technology landing affectively or emotionally with the staff? And so in this case, we really focus the workshop on identity and shared purpose. What is the point of this technology, and how does this link into the values and shared purpose of the group? And a big emphasis here on external collaboration. So in this case, bringing in a couple of doctoral level behavior analysts to do some cool data analysis, use that data analysis to inform the workshop that was highly individualized. In this case, we took the process-based assessment tool, or PBAT, developed by Steve Hayes, that is really kind of the basis of idiomatic analysis. We modified it so that it was really linked into running peak sessions, so using this technology. By doing so, we could create a network analysis so we could understand what behavioral processes led to the outcomes we were looking for. Here's an example of feeling more competent when using the technology. And what we see is that choosing to do things that are clinically important to me, the ability to change or adapt programming, were both positively linked to feeling competent. Things that were negatively linked to feeling competent included feeling stuck and unable to change their programming, not finding important ways to challenge themselves, doing things simply to comply with what others want. Those were negative. And so when we create the workshop, what we're then able to do is look at the relational framing of the group. So here's our pre-intervention data. What this kind of graph shows is the closer together things are in this geometric space, the more strongly related they are to one another. And so if we look at some of these terms, what we see is a cluster of positive stuff over here, the green stuff. Competence, flexibility, feeling relaxed, life values, workplace values, and actually the agency right in the center of it, which is great. People love to work there. And that totally is consistent with what we were observing when we were there. And then we have some negative stuff over on the other side. Things like feeling unwilling, stressed, inflexible, low competence. Away actions, thoughts at work were sometimes negative. And here's peak right in the middle of it. It's not good, it's not bad. It's just something we got to do. We implement the workshop based on this model, and here's the post-test data. And so now you actually see the collapsing in of these positive and negative networks. But the important part is that you see peak and myself and the agency now at the center of that positively balanced network. This looks like we made it up. I understand that. It's not as great as it looks over time. So Dana will address that in a minute. And then finally, does group problem solving using the prosocial matrix lead to improved CDPs? So same sort of thing, but using our PIC analysis, what we're able to show is that when we use this prosocial matrix strategy, we actually increase positive ratings of each of the 8 CDPs. We see that the group felt that they were performing better, had more information, and that they were involved as a community. We see more positive affective ratings across peak as a technology, AIM as a technology, the agency itself, supervision and training, sessions, the center itself, developing materials, thoughts and feelings at work, and so on. We see a greater willingness to engage in all of these stimuli at work. We see lower levels of stress on our perceived stress scale at work. We see lower emotional exhaustion of the employees, lower depersonalization, and we see an increase in reported personal accomplishment.
So the next dimension that we need to address is that the work we're doing is conceptually systematic. So as Jordan was outlining, key aspects of our process are defining those behaviors and considering how we best analyze behavior in order to see if what we're doing makes an impact. But what underlies this work is to be conceptually systematic with the field of behavior analysis more broadly. So one of our kind of professional responsibilities to work as behavior analysts, it's critical that we identify specific learning processes and establish behavioral principles that underlie any approach that we're using in intervention. And so from our experience, and also per the data that we've collected, Prosocial offers enormous utility to organize principles and processes in an effective way, right? From what the data that Jordan was just reviewing with you, when we are utilizing these prosocial oriented approaches, we're seeing changes in behavior in the direction that we want it to go for the most part. However, we need to be able to speak the language of behavior analysis to explain why those changes are occurring. So kind of in broad strokes, some of the established principles that guide our work using the prosocial approach is operant learning, looking at positive and negative contingencies of reinforcement and punishment. Relational frame theory, which looks at arbitrarily applicable relational responding. Derived responding, the transformation of stimulus function, more verbally oriented behavioral processes, and relational density theory, which looks at the strength of relations, the resistance to change, the self-organization of verbal relations as people engage in them and with their environment. So with this work, what you can see in our work with organizations is that so much of this, I was noticing Jordan using a lot of these words as he was even describing the analysis with these programs. It comes down to the contingencies largely in a lot of our work. And so we're looking at operant contingencies using a 3-term contingency analysis to consider the behavior of the individual in the environment that they're engaging in, their workplace environment in our case. What are the antecedents and consequences that are having a functional impact on the way that they're responding? And coupled with that, how do we understand their relational learning, right? How do we look at the way not only they're responding directly to their environment, but how they're responding to relationships between and among stimuli, right? How they are engaging with the world in a more verbal manner. And then we look, when we're moving beyond the analysis of an individual's behavior to the behavior of people in groups, we start to discuss interlocking contingencies. How can we analyze systems of interdependent behaviors within a group that impact one another? How the antecedents and consequences of one person's responding are interconnected with the behavior of another. And then when we think of this even beyond the behavior of a group, right, and thinking about this more of group behavior, we start to discuss meta contingencies, looking at the relationship between interlocking behavioral contingencies within a group or a series of groups and the outcomes that affect the larger environment or culture, right? Questions that we might ask later on down the road, maybe someday, are questions like, how is the work that we're doing with these organizations impacting the culture, the climate of the field of behavior analysis itself? And so the final kind of key element here in our behavioral discussion of prosocial is that despite the level of analysis, the same underlying concepts apply. And Skinner, in multiple places, discussed selection by consequences at 3 levels, and all of these informing the work that we do implementing in our work, right? He talked about natural selection, the selection by consequences across generations via genetics. He talked about operant conditioning, selection by consequences within an individual's lifetime, and cultural selection, looking at the selection of societal norms, traditions, and shared practices across generations via social learning.
Amazing. And so all of that conceptual work, all of these applied challenges and prosocial as an approach has really challenged us to be technological as one of the dimensions, which as behavior analysts, we want to make sure that we're describing our procedures clearly and in detail so that procedures can be replicated by other teams and in novel settings. And so I just want to run through, I guess, a few of the technologies that we've used and developed throughout this process that we're kind of trying to find ways to disseminate them as we go. So the obvious stuff, right? This is the stuff we all use. So we have this amazing book by Atkins, David Sloan Wilson, and Steve Hayes on Prosocial. That was our starting point. As soon as Apex came to us and they're like, hey, we want to make a more act consistent climate, we're like, I think there's a book on that. Read this book, and that's what got us involved. We were like, oh my goodness, this actually has like all the answers. And then the prosocial matrix is really taking the ACT matrix that's used at the individual level and transforming it slightly so that it can be used at the level of groups. And I love this distinction that Dr. Stu Libman said, which is really so that we can move from organizations or systems that are simply surviving to organizations and systems that are thriving on the right side of the matrix. And again, none of this is anything we created. This is just stuff we commonly use. We were able to adapt Robert Stiles' concept of a trend analysis to create a guided interview that you can use with organizations. And really what this is intended to do is take that idea of surviving and thriving and start to map out, what does that look like? So what does it look like? What does a negative outcome look like today? What would it look like 4 months from now, 8 months from now, 12 months from now? In our settings, that might be like we don't exist anymore. On the other hand, what does thriving look like? Can we set benchmarks for now, in 4 months, in 8 months, and 12 months, so that we can build towards thriving, towards that preferred and probable future? We created a guided interview so that we could start to create a version of a functional analysis of the CDPs in organizations. So here's an example of like one of the question sets from this interview. This is looking at CDP3, fair and inclusive decision making. First, we want to get a qualitative piece of information. How are important decisions made that impact the team? And then we do our pick analysis. So we have a question about performance. Do members at multiple levels report that decisions are fair and lead to desirable outcomes? We have our informational analysis. Are members aware of how decisions are made, including who informed the decisions and why? And our community analysis. Are the members most impacted by decisions included in all parts of the decision making? There's a contingency analysis that you can do. So this is understanding that context. We have our M+, which are our positive motivation variables. What are the potential benefits of the team if we do include all members in decision making? And our M-, what are the barriers to including people in important decisions? So why aren't we? And there are often actually like reasons usually that benefit people hierarchically for not including people, which is a problem. And from there, we can actually produce this graph that I showed you earlier, showing performance across those different CDPs. We talked a little bit about the multidimensional scaling procedure. Basically, that gives us a way to visualize relational framing that might impact group decision-making and affect. We have our adapted process-based assessment tool that really breaks down experiences across the process areas of affect, cognition, attention, social, motivation, overt behavior, goal orientation, adaptation, persistence. So you see a lot of evolutionary principles showing in. And all that really does is informs this network analysis. So we can highlight those key pieces. Our affect and willingness scale, just really getting at those emotional functions of stimuli. It's customizable. You can put any stimulus you want. And when we have multiple stimuli, we can create a graph that shows how those stimuli are landing in the workplace that you're in as a relative ranking, and how the affect of stimuli might impact people's willingness to engage with those stimuli. So more of an outcome variable. And then, is any of this effective? Good question. As within 7 dimensions of ABA, we want to adopt inductive and iterative approaches to make sure that our interventions are effective. In this case, returning to those applied questions, did any of this work? Well, we see that in multiple instances, we were able to address the challenges that showed up in those settings. And that's the importance of that analytic piece, to show that what we're doing can be effective. And when it's not effective, to modify what we're doing to achieve that effective outcome. So it's not just the first question, does this work or not? It's the secondary question of, okay, if it didn't work, now what? And continuing to chip away at the problem until we're able to solve it. And all of this comes back to that pragmatic truth criterion. Our models, our ideas, our theories, our concepts are only good to the extent that they worked to address a socially important challenge. And in each of these cases, we do see that they are provisionally working. But do they work generally?
So the final piece to the ABA puzzle is generality. So are these behavior change outcomes that we obtain durable over time? Do they maintain? And are these intervention strategies things that generalize across populations, across settings, across time? So just to quickly return to two of our examples to think about how we're considering generality. This is kind of often the long forgotten dimension of behavior analysis, where we often see interventions that work and then we see the analysis disappear. We don't know if they work long term. And so we're trying to attend to this variable intentionally in our work. So with Apex, Jordan talked about the intervention we developed to increase ACT consistent performance feedback to students using performance feedback as an intervention. And so he showed you the graph with the middle school and the high school. We had great results at the end of the school year. After a summer break, we returned to school, and into the fall, we started seeing a drop in their responding. We were seeing less ACT consistent feedback provided by the staff. It wasn't maintaining over time. So that year, we started monitoring the data again, and we worked with the staff to develop a minimum criteria for acceptable performance. So we agreed that if at least 80% of the staff comments were ACT consistent, that is sufficient. And so what we did is just monitor this data, and if the performance dropped below that level, we reinstated feedback until it became stable again. So we continued this process throughout the school year, and there were, I couldn't remember exactly, but there were only 2 or 3 instances throughout the school year that we needed to reintroduce that feedback. So with that one simple change in the contingency, we were able to get that behavior to start to maintain over the course of the second school year. And at PLE, we're thinking of those relations related to the peak relational training system using that MDS data that Jordan was showing you, where it looked like at the end of our intervention, they absolutely loved peak. It was the greatest thing that ever existed on this planet. Later in the school year, we re-administered that MDS procedure, and the results still looked pretty good for peak. I gotta say, they still had some pretty positive relations around the peak system. However, they were starting to weaken a bit. So we were seeing some deterioration over time with that group as well. So this is now in progress. We're starting our second year of intervention with this group. And in the first year, we focused on the organization as a whole in our work with them. And this year, we're switching to focusing on individual classroom peak systems. The new element we're bringing into our work is behavioral systems analysis. And now we're beginning the work of individually working with each classroom to identify a self-generated peak-related goal for the year that we can support them with for the next 9 months or whatever it might be.
So if we return back to prosocial and the 7 dimensions of ABA, I think we do see that this can be something that's incredibly useful to behavior analysts. Prosocial is clearly applied. We can approach it behaviorally. We can analyze its effects. We can conceptually tie it back to well-established behavior change principles easily enough, especially when we have relational frame theory and the concept of the meta-contingency. We can be technological with it. When we are, it tends to be effective, and oftentimes it's generalizable, but much more research is needed on this final dimension. All of this, though, does beg the question, what is prosocial? Because if you're looking across all of these different applications, it looks very different. It's different analysis, it's different interventions. So what even is it? If we approach that question mechanistically or structurally, it's a big question mark. It's really hard to pinpoint a specific mechanism or structure that defines what prosocial is or can be. However, if we approach the question contextually or pragmatically, prosocial is a lot of things. It's an approach. That approach can lead to a multitude of frameworks. Those frameworks can lend themselves to the development of multiple technologies. Importantly, when we view it in this way, we have a prosocial that's highly variable, those effective elements that can be selected, and behavior change that can be retained over time. And so importantly, what is prosocial? At its best, it's something that works, and it's something that we should continue to do. And so thank you so much for attending to our presentation, here are our emails, and we're around for, I believe, like 30 minutes of questions if Lauren gave me the right times.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Wow. So I am blown away, actually. Um, um, I've got a ton of questions, but I like not to be the first to ask questions. So let's see if who else is wants to ask questions.
And apologies in advance for the information overload. I kind of realized as we were going
Oh,
through.
it was beautifully presented, crystal clear, at least for me. So I think you don't have to apologize by that at all. No, this was masterful. So who all wants to go first? Someone save me from going first.
Go for it, David.
Well, I have a question that might seem like an oddball question, and I think I know the answer to it, but I'm just going to ask it and then I'll follow up from there. Why is it that this approach is so often uh, in a autism spectrum and a severely challenged educational setting? Why is it that that seems to be like the primary focus, when in fact the focus could be so much more general?
You want to take that?
I think that's just a matter of practicality. Those are our background and training is largely in that area. We have a lot of experience serving people with autism and working with those agencies. They're the ones who come to us looking for support. And so kind of, it's just a matter of who we build those collaborative relationships with. But we are certainly interested in moving to other organizations and agencies and whatnot.
Well, I think actually the answer is deeper than that, because I know even from my limited experience that if you go to the AABAI conference, you see just an overwhelming preponderance. And what the answer that I would give to it is that's where the money is. That there's a well-funded insurance or whatever it is that you can be funded. Organizations can have a reliable stream of funding for this. And that's the point that I want to make, that in your handling of this, that's just your starting point. And then, as you have shown, it radiates outward in all kinds of directions and is capable of doing so. But you do have this funding base, which enables you to actually work in real world settings. And when I compare what you've accomplished compared to what Prosocial World has accomplished, in the first place, I want to know, and in many respects, you have accomplished much more. I envy you for what you have accomplished. And when I try to think about why we haven't made the same progress that you have, I mean, we have made progress. I'm not, I think it's because of our lack of opportunity to work in real world settings with a reliable funding base. That's our limiting factor. And with that in mind, I think that when I think of how to help all of us, including you in Grand Rapids and anywhere, it's to just provide more solid funding bases for this. And if we did, whenever that happens, then we could be applying this amazing methodology that you have developed in any context. There could be any starting point. And so that to me reveals just that we're like one step away of doing this more broadly. And that is just a support step. So that was the first point that I wanted to make.
Yeah. And if I could kind of like reflect on that a little bit too, I think you're right. The funding streams for sure. And if we look at the kind of evolution of applied behavior analysis, especially beginning at that like theoretical layer, it's not just that ABA is used to support autistic learners. It's actually really largely used to support a subset of autistic learners, those with the highest support needs. And where you see like the needs for those with the highest support needs are often in the very earliest instances of language learning and a lot of like direct contingencies affecting behavior. And And if a lot of this is based on Skinner's analysis, that got us to that point. And so the technologies that came from that were highly effective with this population that the rest of the world didn't have an answer to how to adequately support. And that's not to say that we've done a great job as a field either. We've done some terrible things with respect to autistic populations, and only now are starting to course correct, now that we know more about the experiences of neurodivergent cultures and communities. And then,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and then what happens is relational frame theory comes along, and that blows open the doors, because now we finally have a conceptually systematic account that can account for the complexities of human language, the complexities of human suffering. And I think that's where you start to see this expanding out. So when you go to like ACBS as an example, that's really adopted RFT. Now you see the application of behavior analysis in areas of mental health, depression, anxiety, other symptomology and case presentation, but still not being able to address the cultural or community challenges that we all face that lead to those symptomologies. That's why I think prosocial and what you developed is so critically important, because that's the piece that answers that question. And now we have the concept that can be expanded out to address those larger cultural questions and challenges.
I want to build on that. So thank you for taking it in this direction. And I think that I want to bring out some things that were implicit in your, but to make them more explicit. One is to celebrate, I think, the best of the behaviorist tradition, including its just entire ethos of science and measurement and iteration and stuff like that. So if you just take the Skinnerian piece of it, then I think that it's part of that you're it's a culture unto itself. And one which is so science-based. It's why it became prominent in the first place. Why was it that for a period of time, behaviorism was like the center of academic psychology? And then why is it that it got replaced by, and some of us know the cognitive revolution and things like that. And so the centers of it end up being in these universities, which are like, I'm not disparaging them, lesser universities. Where these centers are still alive and well. But I think so in the first place, that's the strength of the behaviorist tradition. The weakness was that it was so inattentive to mechanisms and so on. That's why there was a cognitive revolution. And then there we have relational frame theory as like going beyond Skinner. And so the way Steve Hayes tells it, to me at least, is that Skinner kind of got language wrong. There's something about language that actually is different than just operant conditioning. And there the whole world of symbolic thought comes into it, which is beyond Skinner. And so we have a combination of the whole culture and ethos of Skinner, plus the behaviorism layer, because after all, there remains operant conditioning, that's still there. And then onto that, we add this cognitive and what we use the word language to represent, but actually it goes way beyond language. And then so now we have something which is even more complete and which maps even more onto evolution in terms of symbolic thought, dual inheritance theory, and all of that. So if you any comments you'd like to make about that, I'd love to.
Well, just to your point, I'm sure Jordan has thoughts, but just to your point about like what kind of relational frame theory and this kind of new advancement in the field means, I want to juxtapose that with the reality that maybe like 15 or 20% of behavior analysts are trained in using these approaches in their work. So our science is really kind of rolling ahead very quickly, but that the translation of that into the profession of behavior analysis is happening much more slowly than I think we'd like it to see. So it's just an interesting juxtaposition for like what it offers versus how into the field it has gotten so far.
Well, and I think, yeah, to that point, like the importance of the development of technologies, like we can talk theoretically about how to do this all day, but at the end of the day, we need like a tangible thing that people can pick up and use that's built around that technology. And so like for us, Dana mentioned we were part of the team that developed the peak relational training system. why that was so important just in our weird little subfield is that it allowed for relational training with kids. And so we could actually teach them to relationally frame where they weren't able to relationally frame in that same way previously. So that was big because it was something that behavior technicians with no experience or training in RFT could pick up and use tomorrow and start to run this with kids. For Dana, authoring a book called AIM, that's a curriculum really built around acceptance and commitment therapy. Again, people without that specialized training can pick this up and start running lessons and creating programming based on it that can be used tomorrow. And so I think the same thing with Prosocial is the concept is there. And then for us, how do we create a technology that can be picked up and used actually to produce the analysis, to produce the data, to produce the intervention?
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Actually, let me nail down just another little piece of it. When you were saying that behavior analysis applied to autism and other severe disorders has actually caused some harm, I think what you're saying, again, this is based on my conversation with Steve Hayes, is that when it's purely Skinnerian, then it's leaving out what RFT can do, and that the addition of RFT can go even further in teaching language skills and relational skills and so on to go beyond just pure operant conditioning. Is that right? Is that accurate? So it's what I get from Steve Hayes.
I would say that's true. And if we think of like prosocial, right, as like another phase of kind of the evolution of that science, there's a really critical piece, which is that the people who are most affected by decisions are at the table when those decisions are being made. And so when we think of like relational framing or patterns of relational framing are going to be different within neurodivergent groups. And even like at the level of individuals, defining that neurodiversity. When we have our basic models are developed by neurotypical people to create technologies that are used to influence the behavior of neurodivergent people, what we often see is a misuse of those technologies. And I think that's true for like traditional ABA. And I think that can also be true even if our account is informed by RFT and ACT. We can misuse those in just the same way. But if we take that prosocial framework, people impacted are there informing those decisions, creating the technologies are part of that framework. And I think that's how we solve a lot of those challenges more so moving forward.
That's great. Great for you to have pointed that out. Please, somebody speak. Save me from myself.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go ahead here. I feel a little bit cute as well. So nice to meet you, Jordan, Dana, and welcome to Grand Rapids. I'm actually a Grand Rapids native, and I'm moving back there in a few weeks, so we'll have to go out for coffee. So we can talk more about Prosocial here. But
Please,
I guess,
please.
yeah, good. Are you guys there right now?
Yeah.
Oh, good, 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 awesome. Yeah, so I guess what is next, and can you explain more what Antifa, is that the correct name for your
Yeah.
startup? Okay,
Yep.
yeah. So what's next? What are you guys focusing on? Are you doing stuff like in Grand Rapids right now?
Yeah, yep. So we're just starting out with ABA services in Grand Rapids. So we're solidifying some of those initial like funding contracts, hiring behavior technicians and behavior analysts. So it is really like at that initial stage of development. For us, where Prosocial is coming in is like really trying to like weave it into like the fabric of everything that we're doing. So in terms of policies, having a policy about policy development and the policy containing like who informs the development of that policy. When we're creating that policy, having checks across each of the 8 CDPs for that policy, and then suggestions on how to improve that policy over time. In terms of documents around like quality assurance, that same sort of thing of having a quality assurance committee that informs the development of the quality assurance plan so we know what to monitor and that those monitors are based on the shared identity and purpose of the group. And now that we're kind of looking at our training systems, how do we support and resource the psychological flexibility of members coming in? How do we think of the team as a network of experiences? And then how do we use that to create like a pretty robust like training infrastructure? So I don't know if that really answers the question, but like that's what it's looking like at this kind of phase one, is how do we just set it up?
See, I think that, um, uh, the great prospect here is that when we launch place-based initiatives, as we would love to do in Grand Rapids, maybe we can with the help of Mitch, then what we can do is exactly what I mentioned earlier, is we can expand this beyond the secure funding base of that you already have, which is nevertheless limited in terms of context. And by conveying this to the right people, we could apply it to an entire region, a city and its surrounding bioregion, let us say. So it's like that's what I think is what we could do by coincidence, almost serendipitously, in the very city that you've chosen to live in, or of course any other city, because it's basically the secure funding base. I think we do have the technology between what you've done, what Prosocial World has done, and other gifted people. Is basically it's an engine just waiting to be implemented and fueled any place on Earth. And so
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think part of the motivation of getting out of that university setting as like the exclusive thing that we were doing is like it was great to research it, but it's almost like we had to actually create like the counter force or create the counter technology to really affect the field in the way that we wanted to. And it starts with, yeah, like the policies and procedures, but ideally builds out, you're right, to how do we influence this within like our geographic area? And then how do we influence this kind of beyond it? So yeah, I'm super excited to dive into that, and especially like beyond ABA, a lot of that just like neurodiversity affirming like perspective is so important. And I think like beyond that, like if behavior analysis exists or doesn't is inconsequential. But how are we just improving the experience and well-being of autistic people in our society? Chip, you're muted.
Chip, you're muted, but I'm happy for you to speak.
Sorry, I'm in my our grandkids have Rosh Hashanah off from school for reasons that are not clear why they should around here. So I'm in my son-in-law's home office. Let me take what David said in a peculiar direction, but first with a caveat. And that is, my own personal training is very anti-Skinner as a political scientist. So David has met one of my mentors, Bob Putnam, and certainly the whole Michigan approach to political behavior was through values and beliefs and attitudes. So we end up at behavior, but we get there through what goes on inside your head more than the Skinner approach. And, personally, I know I need to get over that, but, this is, 50 plus years of professional experience. But David's idea about place-based, or I would say locally based peace building, or in this case, your kind of work, Grand Rapids is an interesting place for a couple of reasons. First is there's something there, I think it's called the Acton Institute, which is a libertarian-leaning think tank that got me indirectly to the Mercatus Center at George Mason through and networks of people that David knows. And many of those modern day libertarians take the core design principles very seriously. Less so evolution, less so the Hayes stuff, probably simply because they're not familiar with it. But at an event I was at last week, a lot of those folks seem to be interested in going beyond the core tenets of libertarianism modified by the core design principles. I don't know anyone in Acton at the moment. That's not my world at all, but I can get you to them. The other thing about Grand Rapids is that I'm not sure they'd be interested in the issues you are, but there is a very active community mediation center in Michigan, in Grand Rapids. So I think there are half a dozen in Michigan. The one in Grand Rapids happens to be run by a former student of mine, political scientist turned lawyer turned mediator, Chris Gilman. And I have in the back of my head that her center works on diversity in the school systems. And you're also in that part of Michigan where you have significant faith-based qualms. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. Qualms about conventional approaches to behavior. So there's a lot of anti-vaxxing work there. Certainly in the Dutch Reform community. And so I mean, it might be a fun place to really find people who'd be interested in trying these ideas out.
Yeah, I mean, 100% absolutely. And keeping in mind too, like, there's a lot of career transition to keep up with, but
right.
I mean, there's one, just being part of a community and wanting to be involved in that community is, I think, one dimension of that. And then in terms of like skin in the game, our group Dynamic Behavior Science is really meant to be that broader piece, broadening this out and talking about like diversity in school systems, talking about political science in general, how the community is governed is, I think, exactly like what we were always intending with that other piece of our world, our side hustle.
Yeah, in fact, Jordan and I, both other work that we've done has looked at issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion through the same behavioral lens. And so it certainly ties into some of the other work we've done.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go for that in Grand Rapids, by the way. So yeah, just to speak in as a native, living there for 20 or so years, Grand Rapids is a very weird place, and I think it could be because of the Dutch community there. And I have nothing against the people from Holland, but yeah, it's that's why we also voted in Justin Amash, and he was very libertarian in his views and the only anti-Trump in the Republican Party, but. Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of issues that we could talk about, especially with diversity in Grand Rapids. So, but I was just wondering, have you heard of the biopsychosocio-spiritual approach to medicine? Is that big? Because I know that this is becoming a bigger trend in behavioral psychology, but I'm not so certain if it's consensus, if it's a big part of what you guys do as well. Because in Grand Rapids, I see that this approach being more effective, just because as Chip just alluded to, it's a very spiritual religious community, and actually a lot of people don't believe in evolution. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I wasn't taught evolution until I went to Michigan State University, actually. So there are some hurdles when you preach the good word of pro-social world, just to let you know that you might receive in Grand Rapids.
Well, there's two things. I mean, one is the libertarian community, and there I think in a number of ways we're actually creating a strong tie there. So I mean, what we say is that this approach doesn't map onto any current political position. It's not left, right, or libertarian. It draws us a new configuration, and that new configuration can be very attractive to many libertarians. That's what Chip has found with the Mercatus Center and so on. So we're in a good position. It's not as if work doesn't need to be done, but we're in a good position dealing with moderate conservative and libertarian. And then when we have Chip talking about when basically why did Skinner get such a bad reputation in certain quarters, so that Chip has to overcome something like that, then I think that's in part addressed by relational frame theory, because there, everything that was kind of left out of Skinner per se is brought in with relational frame theory, and that includes spirituality and all of that kind of stuff. And so this means there's a lot of work approaching people who don't know that. Make no mistake. Yeah, make no mistake. There's one challenge. It's a narrative and framing and storytelling. That's why and actually that leads to my last major point. But can be done, and so people who superficially or starting from where they currently are you might think would be difficult to approach, I think are actually very approachable. But it's up to us to tell that story. The point, Mitch, I didn't want to, or anyone else, before I proceed to my own last point that I wanted to make.
I just wanted to mention, just along that point, some of our colleagues who have led the field in relational frame theory have started to do some work around RFT in relation to political polarization. So I definitely think there's some work building momentum in the field that in an area like this where you do see, I think, many different expressions of belief systems, that it could be an interesting place to look.
So Dana, I'll look into that, because part of my central focus is how do we deal with political polarization. And I'm personally almost as far left as you can imagine without gagging, but my job has me working with people I disagree with. And yeah, and I think prosocial is one of those approaches that lets you bridge divides comfortably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
CDP1, you have the same strong identity, same purpose. You just promote the same shared identity,
Right. Right.
Yeah.
which is the American identity, which we've seemed to lose over
Yeah,
the past.
one of the people, well, David Gears Up, who was at this thing at the Mercatus Center last week, is actually someone my wife and I have known for a while, because we met him at her first husband's 70th birthday party. But Daryl Davis is a high-end boogie woogie jazz pianist who plays swing dances, which is what the birthday party was. But he's also African American. And what he's ended up doing by default is using his music and his ability to reach into white communities. He has led 200 or so people out of the Klan over the last 20 years. And what was not that, I mean, that's bizarre in and of itself, but the Mercatus people thought he was important because he uses, I think, versions of more positive psychology than what you guys do. But he uses those behavioral tools to make connections that bring people out, and it resonated with the libertarians every bit as much as it liberated with crazy lefties like me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Well, here's my last major point, and I think, and it's I've had many conversations with Steve and Tony Vigeland and others about it. It's this like prediction and influence piece. And as you put it, I actually wrote it down. What did you say? Rather than abstract truth. And so it's like an either or thing. On the one hand, we have prediction and influence. We want to discover what works. And then the rather than whatever abstract truth might mean. And I think that is like needless. I mean, please, could we have yes and not no but? Could we do that, please?
No.
No. So, I mean, it's an objective knowledge with something that we can say that's we're really, discerning the world that exists apart from our existence. The amazing thing about our species is that, on the one hand, so much is socially constructed. We imagine our worlds and then we turn them into reality. But on the other hand, despite that, we live in a world that exists without the way we think about it. If you doubt that, stand in front of an avalanche. Okay.
Oh, I doubt that. And I will stand in front of the avalanche. But the reason being, even if we're talking about the concept of existence, right? Inevitably, the conversation will become, is the concept of existence itself useful? And as soon as we start to discuss existence in terms of its utility as a concept, immediately we're into a pragmatic philosophy again. Because in some circumstances, there may be utility in assuming its existence. And then in other circumstances, it may lack utility, and therefore we assume it does not exist. And I think that's the beauty of the contextual position. It can both exist and not exist at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh no, David's been reading a lot of John Stuart Mill, I know, so he's got a lot to say.
Yeah, for
well,
sure.
I mean, the whole tradition of tradition of pragmatism. But I think the way I would put it, and then is that we just have to keep two things in mind, and to distinguish between them, and then understand the very, very complex relationship between them. And so the first I call practical realism, and that's what you mean by understanding and influence. The other is factual realism, what a science would call a statement about the world that can be validated by observation. Just first of all, identify these two things and understand both of them well, and then begin to unpack the very, very complex trade-off between them, which is why so often our meaning systems sometimes showcase and protect factual knowledge. There's all kinds of contexts in which we know that we need to see the world the way it really is, and we implement the appropriate norms to do so. Those are the norms of science, the norms of responsible journalism, the norms of judicial procedure. I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We identify contexts in which it's important to know the facts of the matter. And in those contexts, we do have the norms to make sure that that precious information is retained. So factual realism is something we need to understand very well. Then, of course, there's practical realism, which is we need to survive and reproduce. And so we need to understand that too, not to denigrate it. Quite the contrary. And then the trifecta, the goal to work towards, is meaning systems that score strong on both, basically. They psychologically animate us, they lead to the right behaviors, and we could defend them according to the best of our scientific knowledge. And so I'd love to work towards a position in which we recognize all three, rather than denigrating isn't quite the right word, but saying rather than abstract knowledge, I think is like demoting abstract knowledge for no good reason. So I think that's a conversation that I do have. I mean, I've written about it extensively, but would love to have here, and to reach some kind of consensus. Basically, when we talk, we don't want to needlessly interfere with each other. There'll always be zones of constructive disagreement. That's what science is. But actually, as we craft a narrative and we jointly approach others to pursue this, then we should come to agreement on key points like this. So I'll happy for your feedback right now, and then of course we'll continue.
Well, Jordan, I would probably approach it in different ways. My thought is, like, as we were presenting information today, thinking of all this through the lens of applied behavior analysis and through our own philosophical lenses, that idea of looking for a truth is just not a needed component in the work that we do, right? It's just not, regardless of whether or not it is worthy in general, in our approaches and how we formulate and ask and answer questions, our approach that's not a necessary component of the analysis. So I would say that's kind of, at least in this work that we're doing, it's all grounded in that contextual approach. Is this workable in this context for this group now? And whether or not it would be true void of context is not the question we're asking. Jordan probably would.
Weren't you trying to find your results to be generalizable?
Yes.
Of course you want them to be generalizable.
Yeah, across the, okay, maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I mean, we can't go on and on at this moment, but I don't think that you can that you can sustain that argument, Dana, especially given your exemplary scientific approach. So, but anyhow, we're not going to solve this.
I think if I could, I mean, this is Pierce versus James, right? And their different approaches to pragmatism, in that I believe Pierce almost started using the term like pragmaticism.
Yeah, they had disagreements, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think the important point is that though they may have disagreed on some of like the very, very fine details of what is or is not, they broadly worked effectively together. And I think that like joint message of that we should be using science and empiricism to make the world a better place was that commonality and was that common shared value. And so, while I think it can be totally fun to like bicker back and forth about pragmatism, because I love to do it and you do too, I agree with your broad point that in approaching then our local communities, other stakeholders, and so on, I think the unified message is clear. What is the purpose? What is the goal? And how can we use prosocial as a way to better achieve that together?